So in recent Musings videos, so-called, I have been focusing a little bit on the Lotus Sutra in terms of the surprise developments in the arising of a fantastic stupa into the sky, namely the precious stupa of the Buddha of Abundant Treasures, who came to the Saha world and exposed himself to the assembly that were gathered to hear the Lotus Sutra being preached by Shakyamuni Buddha, in order to praise Shakyamuni for preaching the Lotus Sutra. You'll recall that he said excellent to Shakyamuni because of his wanting to acknowledge and praise and encourage further propagation and promulgation of the Lotus Sutra of the Wonderful Law. And of course, prior to that chapter on the precious stupa in the Lotus Sutra, we heard the Buddha strongly encouraging bodhisattvas in particular to preach the Lotus Sutra, to read, to recite, to copy it. And actually, in the assembly at that time, the Buddha also exhorted the bodhisattvas to preach the Lotus Sutra. But then, in a contradictory way, a development came about where, in the next chapter on the bodhisattvas emerging from the earth, all these very large number of great bodhisattvas emerged from the earth out of thin air, really, not out of thin air, but out of the earth. And the Buddha at that point said that it was not really necessary for those in the assembly to make any kinds of commitments to preach the law, because he was rather going to rely upon these Buddhas who emerged from the earth. And of course that created puzzlement among the assembly, and Maitreya in particular, the Bodhisattva Maitreya, made inquiry of the Buddha because everybody was confused. And of course the Buddha explained that those in the assembly had merely been his followers for a period of some small number of years, whereas these that came out of the earth, he has been teaching for kalpas and kalpas, for eons of time. So they were more well prepared, if you will, more qualified, if you will, to take the teaching to the next step and to actually teach what the content was in the Lotus Sutra in the next chapter, because that chapter contained a content so amazing, so difficult for people to accept and appreciate, that he felt like he needed people to teach that. He needed bodhisattvas, great bodhisattvas, to teach that, who had full conviction and understanding of the truth and the nature of that teaching that was going to come about in the next chapter. And I want to focus in this particular video and do some musings on that next chapter in the Lotus Sutra, along with reading perhaps some substantial portions of it for you. And of course, that's the chapter on the eternal life of the Buddha. That's the chapter where we learn, to the surprise of the assembly, because again, how could he have been teaching for eons and eons if he himself only was born in the Shakya clan around 500 BC and, attained enlightenment and then taught for some 45 years and then became extinct. In other words, he died. He attained his so-called parinirvana. If that was the case, then how in the world could he have taught these other bodhisattvas who have been around for such a long time, such a long time as described in the sutra? Well, that was the answer. The answer was the Shakyamuni that they were seeing and hearing preach in the context of this particular assembly, which, again, just as a sidebar, even though it's in the Lotus Sutra, which was written after the Buddha's life, we're reading the sutra as if it were the historical Buddha, okay? But here's the point. How could that possibly be true if he had this lifespan, as do all of us, of anywhere from, 60s to 70s to 80s, maybe 90 years? And then how could he have taught all these other bodhisattvas who've been around for so long? Well, again, he teaches in the next chapter that he only presented himself as having this limited lifespan, that in truth he had a lifespan that was immeasurable. Now, you've heard me speak many times about the so-called Trikaya doctrine, or the three-body doctrine, where we have the Dharmakaya, the Sambhogakaya, and the Nirmanakaya. And as a prelude to focusing in on this chapter on the eternal life, I thought I would just get out my huge, I can't even hardly lift it, the Princeton Dictionary of Buddhism, edited by Buswell and Lopez, and see what they had to say about the Trikaya. So in Sanskrit, that term Trikaya means three bodies, and they describe it as one of the central doctrines of Mahayana Buddhology. And I, again, refer to it many times in my own mind and to help me in my own understanding of the nature of Buddha, particularly in the context of the formless Buddha of the Dharmakaya, the spiritual level Buddhas and Bodhisattvas of the Sambhogakaya, and of course the Nirmanakaya, or form body, of the historical Shakyamuni. The three bodies refer specifically to three distinct bodies or aspects of a Buddha, different aspects of the Dharmakaya. The Dharmakaya, or the Dharma body, or truth body, the Sambhogakaya, the enjoyment body, or reward body, and Nirmanakaya, or emanation body, or transformation body. The issue of what actually constituted the Buddha's body arose among the mainstream Buddhist schools over such questions as the body he used on miraculous journeys, such as the one he took to Tristrimsa heaven to teach his mother, Maya. The conclusion was that he had used a mind-made body. Since the physical body of the Buddha was subject to decay and death, was it a suitable object of refuge? With the development of Mahayana thought, the notion of Dharmakaya evolved into a kind of transcendent principle in which all Buddhas partook, and it is in this sense that the term is translated as truth body. So what you'll recall is that the end of the previous chapter, namely the chapter on the Bodhisattva springing up out of the earth, Maitreya is basically saying, we in the assembly believe that you have taught these other Buddhas for eons and eons, but how in the future is anybody going to believe it? He said, we hearing it from the Buddha, in other words, they were in the direct assembly, hearing with their own ears out of the Buddha's mouth. We, hearing it from the Buddha, have no doubts on this matter. But we beg that the Buddha for future hearers will explain, that they may understand. If any should doubt and disbelieve this sutra, he would fall into the evil path. Be pleased to expound for them now how these innumerable bodhisattvas in so short a time have been instructed and converted and abide in the never-retreating state. So he's pleading really to the Buddha to explain this, and in the chapter 16 of the Lotus Sutra on the revelation of the eternal life of the Tathagata, the Buddha gives an explanation. And here's how he begins that explanation in the prose section. It said that at that time the Buddha said to the bodhisattvas and all the great assembly, believe and discern, all you good sons, the veracious word of the Tathagata. Again he said to the great assembly, believe and discern the veracious word of the Tathagata. And again he said to all the great assembly, believe and discern the veracious word of the Tathagata. Then the great host of bodhisattvas, Maitreya at their head, folded their hands and said to the Buddha, world-honored one, be pleased to expound the matter, and we will believingly receive the Buddha's words. Thus they spoke 3 times, repeating the words, be pleased to expound the matter, and we will believingly receive the Buddha's words. So a big emphasis on, you're going to hear something now that seems unbelievable, but it's true, and it's important that you believe it. And those in the assembly said, we will believe it. Please give us more detail and explanation of how you trained these bodhisattvas over eons of time. Then the world-honored one, perceiving that the bodhisattvas thrice without ceasing repeated their request, he addressed them, saying, Listen, all of you, attentively to the secret, mysterious, and supernaturally pervading power of the Tathagata. And here, to get back a little bit to the topic of the Trikaya doctrine, according to Chi, who was one of the major teachers within the Tendai tradition that focused on the Lotus Sutra, he indicated that the word secret, and by secret is meant that the one body of the Buddha is three bodies, and by mysterious it meant that the three bodies are in the one. Spirituality, or supernaturally pervading power, or power of spiritual or supernatural pervasion, or ubiquity, is the function of the three bodies, or Trikaya: the Dharmakaya, or truth body, or law body; the Sambhogakaya, or reward body, or bliss body; and the Nirmanakaya, or mutation body, or response body. Dharmakaya indicates the Buddhahood in its universality; Nirmanakaya, the Buddhahood embodied or personalized; and Sambhogakaya, the Buddhahood as spiritualized. Chi attributes the revelation of the Trikaya in this form to this passage and emphasizes the unity of the Trinity as constituting the only correct doctrine of the Buddha's person and reality. I'll repeat that sentence, and of course I won't go on a rant about how this compares or contrasts with the Christian notion of the Trinity. That would be a topic for another time. But here again, what the Buddha is saying to the assembly, he says, "Listen then, all of you, attentively to the secret, mysterious, and supernaturally pervading power of the Tathagata. All the world of gods, men, and asures consider." And here he's giving the bottom line. "Now has Shakyamuni Buddha come forth from the palace of the Shakya clan, and, seated at the training place of enlightenment, not far from the city of Gaya, has attained perfect enlightenment." So that's his story as a transient Nirmanakaya. Okay? Now we get the however. "But, my good sons, since I veritably became Buddha, there have passed infinite, boundless hundreds of thousands of myriads of kotis, of nayutas, of kalpas." Huge amount of time, eons and eons. And then there's some ways he has of emphasizing how long the time period that is. He says, now, at this time, in this Lotus Sutra, now I must clearly announce and declare to you, suppose you take as atomized all those worlds where an atom has been deposited or where it has not been deposited, and count an atom as a kalpa. The time since I became Buddha still surpasses these by hundreds of thousands of myriads of kotis, of nayutas, of asamkaya kalpas. Well, what's he been doing for all this time, all these eons? From that time forward, I have constantly been preaching and teaching in this Saha world, and also leading and benefiting all living beings in other places, in hundreds of thousands of myriads of kotis, of nayutas, of asamkaya domains. So he has been all over the universe, teaching in various Buddha fields and Buddha lands. Good sons, during this time I have ever spoken of myself as the Buddha of burning light and other Buddhas, and also have told of their entering into nirvana. So in those other lands he also has manifested a Nirmanakaya, or a temporary form, with a birth and a death. Thus I have tactfully described them all. He uses tactfulness. We can't conceive of the nature of the Dharmakaya. It's formless. It's beyond all words and concepts. So since we can't perceive it directly, it can't really impact us in terms of assisting us on our spiritual path. But as a result of that paradox, if you will, the Dharmakaya manifests in the form of the Sambhogakaya and the Nirmanakaya. And these levels of the Buddha body, these aspects of the Buddha body, contain this profound compassion and pity for us, and the wisdom that leads us toward an appreciation and awareness and an insight that the dualistic nature that we ordinarily perceive the reality around us in is only a provisional kind of reality, and in effect, by being stuck in it, that we are basically ignorant of the true nature of reality. Thus I have tactfully described them all. He is tactful. That's the nature of chapter 2 in the Lotus Sutra, tactful means. So this chapter on the eternal life of the Buddha is one of the two most critical chapters in the Lotus Sutra, as is chapter 2 on skillful means or tactfulness. So how does the tactfulness work? Here he's explaining what he has done in the context of these other aspects of the Buddha body. Whenever living beings come to me, I behold with a Buddha's eyes all the faculties, keen or dull, of their faith and so on. And I explain to them, in stage after stage, according to their capacity and degree of salvation, my different names and the length of my lives, and moreover plainly state that I must enter nirvana. So we have to have a human form in order to be able to relate. Most people do. And so that's why the Buddha manifests himself as a nirmanakaya, or a form body, and speaks of the idea of nirvana and the idea of attainment of nirvana, as well as parinirvana, which would be the death of that particular manifestation, if you will, of the Trikaya. And by the way, when he talks about different names and the lengths of his life, think about that too in the context of an interfaith kind of concept, where if you want to think of God, or of the Godhead as the Dharmakaya, and God in a sense as a form of Sambhogakaya, that different religions have different names for God, but basically it's the same God. It's the same Dharmakaya ultimately that represents truth and formless reality. So he goes on, I also in various tactful ways preach the wonderful law which is able to cause all the livings to beget a joyful heart. So there, in a general way, he's referring to the Buddha Dharma, which of course is the second of the three treasures that we take refuge in. But he's also in particular on this occasion talking about the Lotus Sutra, the wonderful law, which is able to cause all the living to beget joyful heart. And why do we beget a joyful heart? Because of the fact that he exists eternally. Because of the fact that the Sambhogakaya Buddha continues to be available to us as a source of comfort, as a source of refuge, and that we can entrust in him, because it was a dilemma for the earlier Buddhists as far as if we take refuge in the Buddha and if he dies, where are we at then? And that's part of what was covered in the Dictionary of Buddhism that Boswell and Lopez put together in that particular entry on the Trikaya doctrine. So then he goes on, beholding the propensities of all the living toward lower things, so that they have little virtue and much vileness, to these men the Tathagata declares, in my youth I left home and attained perfect enlightenment. So again, he adapts and gives that story to us as a provisional story, because we're not capable, most people are not capable at that stage of accepting this eternal life reality that is so hard to accept. So hard to accept that he wasn't willing to rely upon the bodhisattvas in his assembly, and had to tap these bodhisattvas emerging from the earth to be able to really go out and convince people of the truth of this particular doctrine. But here is the truth. Since I verily became Buddha, thus have I ever been, and thus have I made the declaration, only by my tactful methods, to teach and transform all living beings, so that they may enter the way of the Buddha. In other words, thus has he made the declaration about the time-limited lifespan, only by tactful methods, to teach and transform living beings, so that they may enter the way of the Buddha. And here we remember in chapter 2, what is the reason the Buddha came into the world? What is the whole point of the thing? What's the whole point of Buddhism? It's to help beings become aware that there is a way of the Buddha, and to aspire to and to undertake the treading of the way of the Buddha. In other words, to become a Buddha. It's the goal of all Buddhists to become a Buddha. And this is the tactful way that the Buddha had of encouraging people to tread that path. He says all the sutras which the Tathagata preaches are for the deliverance of the living, namely for the helping the people to reduce their suffering. Whether speaking of himself or speaking of others, whether indicating himself or indicating others, whether indicating his own affairs or the affairs of others, whatever he says is all real and not empty air. Form is void. Void is form. Form is no different from void. Void is no different from form. So it's not that the Nirmanakaya, in terms of the time-limited Buddha apparition or manifestation, is unreal. It's real. But this other aspect of the Dharmakaya, namely the Sambhogakaya, is also real. Wherefore? In other words, how can this be? Because the Tathagata knows and sees the character of the triple world, which I think is past, present, and future, as it really is. To him, to the Buddha, there is neither birth nor death, or going away or coming forth, neither living nor dead, neither reality nor unreality, neither thus nor otherwise. And this can be read according to the footnote as, it is neither born nor dies, or it disappears or comes forth. It has no secular existence and no extinction. It is neither real nor unreal, neither thus nor otherwise, which again harkens back to the Heart Sutra, as well as to the notion that there is neither existence nor non-existence, and also to the notion that I've harped on before about this basic idea of unborn, that the Bodhisattva must develop a patient acceptance of the fact that all things and all persons are unborn, which is pretty hard to do. I certainly can't, but it is an aspirational ideal within the context of Mahayana doctrine. Unlike the way the triple world beholds the triple world, the Tathagata clearly sees things such as these without mistake. Because all the living have various natures, various desires, various activities, various ideas and reasonings, so, desiring to cause them to produce the roots of goodness, the Tathagata by so many reasonings, parables, and discourses has preached his various truths. So again, hammering home skillful means, as well as hammering home the Sutra of Innumerable Meanings, which I've mentioned in a recent Musings. The Buddha deeds which he does, in other words, as he manifests these tactful methods, including presenting himself as a being in the world who is born and who does have a lifespan and ultimately dies, the Buddha deeds which he does have never failed for a moment. Thus it is, since I became a Buddha in the very far distant past, that my lifetime is of infinite asamkaya kalpas, forever existing and immortal. Good sons, the lifetime which I attained by pursuing the Bodhisattva way is not even yet accomplished, but will still be twice the previous number of kalpas. But now, in this unreal nirvana, I announce that I must enter the real nirvana. In this tactful way, the Tathagata teaches all living beings. So he's going back now to saying he's going to die. Wherefore, if the Buddha abides long in the world, men of little virtue who do not cultivate the roots of goodness and are spiritually poor and mean, greedily attached to the 5 desires, and are caught in the net of wrong reflection and false views, if they see the Tathagata constantly present and not extinct, they will then become puffed up and lazy, and unable to conceive the idea that it is hard to meet the Buddha or a mind of reverence for him. Therefore, the Tathagata tactfully teaches the following. So he's saying, and he gives a great parable toward the end of this section on the physician whose sons have gone mad, to whom he wants to provide a medicine, but some of them take it and some of them don't. But he's saying if he told everybody that he was going to be here forever, people would be complacent. But if he tells them he's going to die and go away, well, then they will long for him and be more inclined toward pursuing progress on the Buddha way, on the path toward enlightenment. So because of being aware of the nature of beings in this regard, he tactfully teaches, quote, "No, bhikshus, the appearance of Buddhas in the world is a rare occurrence." In other words, he teaches that he refrains from telling them that he's eternal in his lifetime and teaches them that this is a rare thing. And isn't that what we're taught? We're taught it is quite rare for us to be born as a human, quite a source of gratitude, and even rare to be exposed to the Dharma. And of course, within the sort of the Buddhist lore, if you will, there's great emphasis, particularly in medieval Japan, on the idea of these different phases of the Dharma, namely the phase 500 years when the Buddha, just immediately after the historical Buddha passes away, and then another 500 years after that or so where there's just the semblance Dharma. In other words, the true Dharma has been sort of watered down and diluted and no longer completely clear. And then you have a further period of time when the Dharma becomes almost extinct. And of course, eventually, the way we think of it is that Maitreya Buddha ultimately will be the next Buddha on this earth, in this Saha world. So that's the way we think of it, and we therefore think that the Buddha's availability to us as a teacher is quite limited. But here in the Lotus Sutra, he reveals that he actually is available to us in an ongoing way if we were only of a mind to realize it. And that's where, again, in an unorthodox way, I would say that I personally think about this eternal Buddha as Amida Buddha, because I relate to and appreciate that particular narrative that I think most of you are aware of, and I won't get off on a sidebar about that right now. But it's because of how he realizes the limitations of living beings, namely that they are spiritually poor and mean, greedily attached to the 5 desires, caught in the net of wrong reflection and false views, that for that reason, he says, a Tathagata may be rarely seen. All these living beings, hearing such a statement, must certainly realize the thought of the difficulty of meeting a Buddha and cherish a longing and thirst for him. Then will they cultivate the roots of goodness. Therefore, the Tathagata, though he does not in reality become extinct, yet announces his extinction. Again, the method of all Buddha Tathagatas is always like this, in order to save all the living, and it is altogether real and not false. So this harps again on the notion that where the Buddha asks Shariputra, I think it is in the 2nd chapter. So if I use these methods, or I think it's in the 3rd chapter on the burning house, where he uses a false statement to draw his children out of the burning house so that they don't die, am I lying? Is it inappropriate to use falsehoods such as that? And Shariputra says, no, a world-honored one, it's not, because number one, they would have died had you not offered them the various carts that they each were enamored of. And number two, when they came out, you gave them a better cart. You gave them the Mahayana. So no, it's not lying. It's not being deceitful in a way that's harmful. It's helpful because it helps them ultimately make progress on the spiritual path and pursue the Bodhisattva way and ultimately become a Buddha. Now here comes the physician analogy. And this has been a very long video. So, like, if you want to turn off right now, obviously feel free, or you may have turned off after 2 minutes, who knows. But since I have a little bit of my voice and a little bit of my energy left, and again, this is the prose section, all this is repeated in the verse section. I think that I can't remember. I think that the idea was that the prose section was written before the verse section. I could be wrong on that. It might be in the reverse. But in almost all the chapters of the Lotus Sutra, we have a prose section, and then the key elements are repeated in the verse section. But here, and again, this is by use of a parable, which the Buddha loves to use in order to teach us. And this again is the version within the Kosai translation. Suppose, for instance, a good physician who is wise and perspicacious, conversant with medical art, and skillful in healing all sorts of diseases. He has many sons, say 10, 20, even up to 100. Because of some matter, he goes abroad to a distant country. After his departure, his sons drink his other poisonous medicines, which send them into a delirium, and they lie rolling on the ground. At this moment their father comes back to his home. Of the sons who drank the poison, some have lost their senses. Others are still sensible, but on seeing their father approaching in the distance, they are all greatly delighted, and kneeling, and salute him, saying, "How good it is that you are returned in safety! We, in our foolishness, have mistakenly dosed ourselves with poison. We beg that you will heal us and give us back our lives." The father, seeing his sons in such distress, in accordance with his prescriptions, seeks for good herbs, together in perfect color, scent, and fine flavor, and then pounds, sifts, and mixes them, and gives them to his sons to take, speaking thus: "This excellent medicine, with color, scent, and fine flavor altogether perfect, you may now take, and it will at once rid you of your distress, so that you will have no more suffering." Those amongst the sons who are sensible, seeing this excellent medicine, with color and scent both good, take it immediately, and are totally delivered from their illness. The others, who have lost their senses, seeing their father come, though they are also delighted, salute him and ask him to heal their illness, yet when he offers them the medicine, they are unwilling to take it. Wherefore? Because the poison has entered deeply. They have lost their senses, and even in regard to this medicine of excellent color and scent, they acknowledge that it is not good. The father reflects thus: "Alas! For these sons, afflicted by this poison, and their minds all unbalanced, though they are glad to see me and implore me to be healed, yet they are unwilling to take such excellent medicine as this. Now I must arrange an expedient plan so that they will take this medicine." Then he says to the sons, "You should know that I am now worn out and with old age, and the time of my death has now arrived. This excellent medicine I now leave here. You may take it and have no fear of not being better." After thus admonishing them, he departs again for another country, and sends a messenger back to inform them, "Your father is dead." And now, when those sons hear that their father is dead, their minds are greatly distressed, and they thus reflect: "If our father were alive, he would have pity on us, and we should be saved and preserved. But now he has left us and died in a distant country. Now we feel we are orphans and have no one to rely on." Continuous grief brings them to their senses, and they recognize the color, scent, and excellent flavor of the medicine, and thereupon take it, their poisoning being entirely relieved. The father, hearing that the sons are all recovered, seeks an opportunity and returns, so that they all see him. So then, the Buddha in the assembly, in the Lotus Sutra, asks those in the assembly, he says, "What is your opinion? Are there any who would say that this good physician had committed the sin of falsehood?" And everybody in the assembly replies, "No, world-honored one." The Buddha then said, I also am like this. Since I became Buddha, infinite, countless, 100,000 myriad kotis of nayutas of asamkaya kalpas ago, for the sake of living beings, by my tactful power, I have declared that I must enter nirvana. Yet there is none who can lawfully accuse me of the error of falsehood. And then, in the chapter, there's a transition into the verse section. And I want to just share one little couple of verses from the verse section that I love, because here he says, I only say I am extinct. I behold all living creatures sunk in the sea of suffering. Hence I do not reveal myself, but set them all aspiring, till, when their hearts are longing, I appear to preach the law. In such supernaturally pervading power throughout asamkaya kalpas, I am always on the divine vulture peak and in every other dwelling place. And this is the section that I was talking about. When all the living see at the kalpa's end the conflagration when it is burning, tranquil is this realm of mine, ever filled with heavenly beings, parks and many palaces, with every kind of gem adorned, precious trees full of blossoms and fruits, where all creatures take their pleasure. All the gods strike the heavenly drums and evermore make music, showering mandarava flowers on the Buddha and his great assembly. And here's the key line. My pure land will never be destroyed. And so that's what I think about. Amita's pure land. It won't be destroyed. It will be available for us. Those of us who wish to carry that admittedly dualistic narrative in our dualistically oriented brain in order to give ourselves comfort. But in adopting that dualistic narrative, having a deep entrustment of the fact that it resonates with and is consistent with the formless reality of which each of us is a part. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida